Welcome back to the Cornfield Customs channel, and in this episode we are going to continue with the Watson fender build, so stick around as we get our pattern laid out and get ready to start shaping. If you haven't watched the previous videos on the Watson fender, I highly recommend you go back and start from the beginning so you get caught up on where we are, but let's get into the pattern. In the last episode, we went over how to make our paper pattern for the first half of the Watson trailer. So in this episode, we are going to go over the processes of laying that pattern out and getting ready to shape on the power hammer. I tend to get pretty particular on the way I prep my metal for laying the pattern out and transferring all of our information. And it might come across as just being overly picky or overly finicky, but there are methods to my madness, and we're gonna go through that. So I've got a sheet of 18 gauge cold roll steel here, and this is what we're gonna use on the fenders. I have our pattern, but before we can lay that out, we have to clean our sheet metal. And the reason for that is so when we lay out our offset edges, clean up our light lines, anything that we have to stick tape to the material, we know that it's gonna stick and we're not going to have the tape coming off, which is going to take longer to reapply the tape and potentially affect how you feel mentally. How you feel mentally while you're shaping a complicated part is very critical. If you're in a bad mood or irritated, it's just gonna amplify, and you need to be in a very calm state of mind so you can think clearly, pay attention, and do what you need to do to shape this panel. So the first thing we're gonna do is wipe down the panel with isopurple alcohol. I prefer to use alcohol over like lacquer thinner or acetone because I don't like the smell of lacquer thinner or acetone. I don't like how it burns your hands, and I just don't like being around the stuff. So I use 99% isopurple alcohol. So we'll clean that first, let it dry, and then we'll follow it up with glass cleaner. We have our sheet metal laid out here, and we're gonna have to clean a very large area just because our pattern for our blank is gonna be so large that we can't run this across this drop that I have. So we're gonna have to angle it so we can get our edges offset. So we're gonna clean almost all of the sheet. So we'll set our pattern to the side for now. And I've got our isopurple alcohol in this Just Right pump can. We will get our paper towel soaked with alcohol. And scrub everything down. Start cleaning our sheet metal. And then we'll let this dry for a minute and we'll come back with our glass cleaner. Now we can come in with spray away glass cleaner. I prefer using spray away because it doesn't leave any residue on the metal, and you don't have that ammonia smell of some of the other brands of glass cleaner. You can see even after cleaning it with alcohol how dirty the paper towel still is. That just shows that the alcohol doesn't take all of the oil, grease, and dirt off. So from here, we're going to do one more pass with the glass cleaner. Even after the second pass with glass cleaner, you can still see it's a little dirty. It's not nearly as bad as it was. So we're gonna let this dry, and then I'll come in with some tape. We'll do a couple test sticks just to see that the tape is gonna stick. If not, we'll clean it again. But if the tape sticks pretty well, we'll call that good. I usually do 3 passes, so the alcohol and then 2 passes with glass cleaner just to make sure everything is nice and clean. Now that the surface is dry, I'm gonna come in with some of our 3/4 inch masking tape. Just pull off a piece, loop it around so the sticky side is out, and I'm just gonna come around and stick it in a few spots where we cleaned to make sure it sticks really, really well. And I'm really happy with that. And again, this just goes into the fact that we want our tape to stick while we're laying our pattern out. We don't want it to keep peeling off or the edges rolling. That gets into repeating your actions, and it's going to start to get irritating. And once you go down that path of getting irritated while you are working on your panel, you're already setting yourself up for failure. I like to use the time of laying out my pattern to get in the proper state of mind, clear my mind, get rid of any distractions and aggravations from the day. So if I'm trying to do that while laying our pattern out and things like our tape not sticking becomes aggravating, that is just going to be counterintuitive. We really need to focus on clearing our mind and preparing for shaping mentally and physically. That's what we're going to do next. Start laying out our pattern, offsetting our edges, and transferring all of our information from the pattern to our sheet metal. We will come in, take our pattern, position it on our sheet metal to where we're going to have enough room around the edges for a 3/4 inch offset, and I'll get to the reasoning behind that here in a minute. And then we'll take some of our layout magnets and we will start to magnet our pattern to the panel, working it as we go to keep everything nice and flat against our sheet metal. Because if our pattern, say, is bunched up and not laying completely flat, it's going to not give us the information we need where we need it. This just goes hand in hand with, we're going to aim small, miss small, so we need to make sure everything is nice and tight up against the sheet metal so we get an accurate transfer of our information from the pattern to our sheet metal so we can make an accurate part. Next, we are going to start offsetting our edges. And the reason we offset our edges is to give us a little bit of material to play with. If we cut our pattern to the exact size we need, you have to be perfect on every shrink, every blend, every time. And because this is the exact size we need. So by giving us that 3/4 of an inch buffer on each side, it allows us a smaller margin of error, so we don't have to be absolutely perfect because we are human. We're going to make mistakes and not be on point every time. So the 3/4 inch tape that we're going to run around the edge is going to offset that edge by 3/4 and give us that buffer room, and then we'll have material for overlap that we can trim and file fit. The other thing that tape allows us to do is if this line wasn't cut straight with our scissors, which usually it's not perfect, the tape will help us get that line straight, and it'll clean up all the waviness in the cut. So I'm going to come over here, and I hold my tape different. So a lot of people hold their tape like this. I like to put 3 fingers through the center, and then I can guide and rest my hand on the metal so I can get down, stable, and work the tape as need be. So we'll come over here and start, and we're going to come around the corner, and I'll bring the camera over in a minute to show you guys a trick coming around these corners. But I'm working on taking an average of our line that we had cut, because if it's not perfectly straight, this is our chance that we can clean that up with our offset. I moved the camera into just a blank area on our panel here because I wanted to show you a little trick for making perfect 3/4 inch offset corners with a radius with 3/4 inch tape. So if you're doing a low sweep, it's no big deal because the tape will follow that. But if we have to do a tighter radius, say in a corner, there's a trick to this. And I'll show you on the pattern layout here in a minute, but I wanted to show you up close how I make the initial turn before we correct it. So I put my finger on the outside radius of the tape, or where the radius will be, and we're going to come up and we'll make the turn, and I'm just pushing on the outside of the tape. I'm not focused on the inside yet. And you can see that this is all this is all wrinkly, it's not attached. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna come in and we're gonna pull that up a little bit, and then I'll take a Sharpie and we'll use the back end, and we're gonna come in and we're gonna put tucks in our tape. Just like when we made our pattern, we want a similar thing because we're trying to shrink this radius. So we just come in, and then we can take our thumb and we can push those off the edge. And that gets you a very accurate offset. And the reason I spend a little bit of time there is because we are offsetting this edge on our pattern. We're focused on the outside edge, but it's good practice to do it this way, so it's always 3/4 offset. You're creating good habits, and as long as you work towards those good habits, it's gonna become second nature. You're not gonna have to think about doing it if you do it the same way every time. So the reason I find this so critical is if you don't do that, you come in, we'll try to mimic that radius. You come in and you just do this. See how choppy that line is versus up here? We want to make sure that this is a 3/4 inch offset all the way through. That's the point of using tape versus coming in and measuring it with a tape measure. That way we always get an accurate offset, whether it be from the outside edge or the inside edge. So just a little trick I wanted to show you guys. I talk a lot about this when I teach classes and thought you guys would like to see it. Here we are at our pattern, and you can see the same thing. I came in and I used my finger on the outside edge as I made the turn, and then we can come up, pull that back up a little bit, and come in with our Sharpie and start to put our tucks in. And if it doesn't do what you want it to do, just peel it back up a little bit. And now we have a nice clean offset on the inside radius and the outside radius. So I'll do that to the other corner, and then we'll come back in and trim off our excess material in these 90-degree corners. Then I like to come in and cut off the excess material where our tape overlaps in the sharper corners, because we're going to use the outside edge of our tape as a guide for laying out our trim line. From here, I'm going to take our ultra fine tip Sharpie, and we're going to come in and trace around the outside of our tape. I like to use an ultra fine Sharpie. That way, it's, again, reducing that margin of error. We're going to have a cleaner, more defined trim mark, so it'll be less cleanup after we cut it with snips. And I'm pulling gently in against the tape, so the tape is our guide, and that way if we run off of the tape, it's going to run in like this, not out. So we hold it up against the tape, slight pressure in, all the way around. We have our trim line laid out. And the reason I do that first is there's been many times where I get ahead of myself and I start ripping that tape off before I've marked it. So I've gotten in the habit of always doing that first. That way it's done, and in case I get in a hurry or forget to do it at the end, it's already been done at the beginning and I don't have to relay it out. So from here, we are going to come in and start laying out where our light lines are and the radii and where our shrink marks are. I'm going to reposition our panel a little bit so our working area is on the hard surface of the table. And the reason I did that is where our light lines and our shrink marks are, we're going to use a spring punch to mark that. And there's a couple reasons I like to do that. It'll leave a hole in the pattern and the mark on the metal. So if we ever have to line the pattern back up with our blank, all of those dots will be a lot easier to line back up than kind of guessing. And with a small center punch mark in our steel, if our Sharpie marks rub off while we're shaping, we still have those reference marks. And I'm sure you guys are wondering, like, well, you're going to center punch sheet metal, so then you're going to have little marks all over the panel. Yes, we will have light center punch marks, but even if you're metal finishing a panel to be polished, you just have to not put deep marks in. We just want them as a reference mark and something that's easily sandable later. So I don't get too worked up, and usually they disappear by the time we've done all of our shrinking, blending, and planishing. You know, and then at the end, block it with 80 grit, and the marks are gone. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna come in and lay out center punch marks on our first light line, our center line, our second light line, and all of our shrink marks. So we have a semi-permanent reference mark for our pattern and our panel. Now we can take our pattern off and set it to the side. Since we have our overall shape, our offset edges, and we've laid out where our light lines are gonna go, then we can line that back up to finish marking all of our shrinks and our radius. Here you can see our center punch marks, and they're not very deep, they're just there as a reference. So we're gonna come in with more 3/4 inch masking tape, and we will pull lines for our light lines. That way, we're gonna take the average of our center punch marks, because they might not be perfect, and we wanna use the tape to help get those as square as we can and nice and true. Just like I said in the last video, if we shrink to a light line that's crooked, our actual light line is going to end up crooked. So we need this to be nice and as close to straight as we can. That way it's less cleanup in adjusting the light line later on down the road. We'll come in with our 3/4 inch masking tape. We'll start at one end, and like I said, we're going to take an average of our center punch marks. And I'm also going to be sighting down the edge of our panel, trying to keep it pretty close to parallel as I pull this tape. And it might take a couple tries. Again, sighting it, taking an average of our center punch marks. And if you don't like it, don't be afraid to pull the tape off. That's why we do it in tape. You have to be happy with the results you're getting. I feel pretty good about that. It looks pretty consistent across this area, and at the back end, our light line kind of peels out a little bit, and I think that's where the damage was that I mentioned in the first and second video in this series. So from there, I'm gonna start on the next light line using our first light line as a guide. So there is our second light line. Then we'll do the same thing on our third light line. So at this time, we're going to correct any of the wavy light lines because we were taking a pattern off of an old beat up fender, so our light line might not be absolutely perfect. But we do know that it is a constant radius from one end of the fender through to the other end. We know that the start of our radius, which is a light line, the center of that radius, which is a light line, and the end of the radius, that's also going to be a light line, should be parallel to one another because it's a constant radius. So that's why I was just taking an average of our center punch marks to make sure these are pretty close to being parallel all the way down. That way, again, we're not trying to chase a wavy light line. The light line is the most important part. And for me, I don't think about bending metal. I look at it as we're bending light. If the light looks crooked, the panel is crooked. All we're doing is manipulating the metal to reflect light the way we want. And that's what makes a panel appealing. It's the same thing when you do body work. You're block sanding and adding filler to get the light dialed in. If you look at a car that's wavy down the side, the light lines are wavy. So that's all we're doing is making the light do what we want. Let me move the camera so you guys can see this from a different angle, and then I will lay out our light lines, we'll lay our pattern back on, and we can lay out our shrink marks. You can see that our lines are pretty parallel, and you can see some of the center punch marks that were close, and then they disappear, and they come back in. Same thing here, like that's where I said the pattern looked like it was doing this because the fender itself that we did pull the pattern off of was kind of damaged, but it's way over here, then comes back, and you can see it start to line up, and then they disappear, and then they come back here. So when we punched that, the light line on the pattern was wavy, and we're correcting that. And same thing, this should be pretty parallel to the edge. That's why I didn't start here. We would have had a bend in our layout, which is not what we wanted to go for. Now I can take a regular blue Sharpie, and we're going to use the tape as our guide. And we can use a thicker Sharpie at this point because it's just a light line. It's not a trim line. So it's not as critical as when we trim out our blank. So we'll lay out our light lines. Then we can peel these 3 pieces of tape off. Now with the tape pulled off, you can see that center punch mark was on the line, under the line, under the line, on, over, over, under. So we're just using our tape to correct those lines. And same thing here. These were way off, but you can kind of see they follow pretty good, and then they jump over here. We're just taking that creative license. We know this is a parallel line because it's a constant radius. Same thing here. They kind of dove over, and both ends of the fender were damaged. So I'm just gonna take a little creative license, square that up because I know this should be the same radius from one end all the way through to the other. So now we can lay our pattern back on and lay out all of our individual shrink marks. We can lay our pattern back on, lining it up with the edges of our tape. And this is where on a more complicated part that the punch marks really come in handy. If it's hard to line the edge of the pattern up with your tape, you can come back in and find some of the center punch marks, and you can line those up, and you know you're in the exact same spot as you were before. Just another way that you can verify you're in the exact same location by using the center punch marks. And I'm just going to put some magnets above our shrink line. That way we can kind of flip this up later if we need to. So I'll come in with our regular Sharpie, and I'm going to mark where our shrink marks are. And we can take our pattern. Just going to flip this up for now. I'm going to go ahead and peel at least our bottom row of tape. That way when we lay out our shrink mark, it goes all the way to our cut edge, including our offset. So I like to flip the pattern up like this so I can see what was declared a light shrink and a regular shrink. This one's pretty straightforward because it's mostly standard shrinks with a handful of lights. But when you get into a pattern that's more complicated, that has very heavy shrink, medium shrink, light shrink, stretch, and a bunch going on in the panel, I like to be able to flip that up as a reference and not have to constantly drag the pattern back over to look at what our notes were. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to go ahead and label everything where our light shrinks are, just so I don't forget. Then I will come in with a straight edge and mark our light shrinks all the way to our trim edge, making sure that they're as close to perpendicular to our light lines as I can get them. And this is where I said if they're not perfectly perpendicular when we pattern it or perfectly symmetrical, we can address that and clean that up here. Next up is our full shrink. So that goes all the way to our start of the radius on the inside of the fender, while our light shrinks at this end only went to the stop of the radius, towards the outside or the bottom edge of the fender. Then I will come back and we will label each one of these SH for shrink, just like we did on our pattern. There were a couple lines that were a little off on our spacing. Again, I still kind of eyeballed it just to make them more symmetrical, but I cleaned some of that up a little bit as I went. And we know that this is a 2-inch radius. So I'm going to write 2-inch radius in a few spots. I'm going to label this our center line. And now all of our information is laid out and we can take our pattern off. The only thing I didn't put on there is side A and light line. So with our pattern laid out next to our layout, you can see they look the same. Just our light lines are a little bit more defined and tidy. So from here, we can rough cut this out with some electric shears, and then we can come in and cut it with tin snips. With the blank being rough cut out with the electric shears, next I'm going to come in with our hand snips and come around and do our fine trimming. The reason I do that is because I don't feel that I can get an accurate enough cut with the electric shears or a Beverly shear. So I like to do all the rough cutting, get the excess material out of the way, then come back with snips where I can get down on the line, really creep up and get a nice accurate cut.